Everyone. Welcome back to our podcast about music and travel. I'm here with Rocío. This is our third
Hello,
episode. Hello, Rocío.
hello.
Um, so today we're talking about a very interesting topic, one that I think a lot of people are curious about. It's not a lot of information about this out there on the internet, and some of it's incorrect. But who better to talk about it with than a Cuban musicologist, someone who lived in Cuba and has been there after the revolution, where our topic today is Cuban music and the revolution and how music was affected by the revolution. So yeah, get us started, Rosia. Tell us a little bit about what we're going to talk about today.
Oh yes, a passionate theme, no, or subject for many people, and controversial as well in some aspects, but very interesting. No, I think first of all, we should start with a brief introduction of the musical scene in Cuba. If we are pretending to make a more relevant comparison or evaluation of the phenomenon, we should know a little bit more about how was music or how was music seen before this revolution, right? So, for example, during the first half of the 20th century, the Cuban music scene experienced a great development and diversification because we had a lot of genres at the time, such as son, for example, bolero, danzón, cha-cha-cha. All that music achieved great popularity in Cuba at the beginning of the 20th century. And this music was actually very popular because they were consolidated in the 40s and 50s, mainly in places like nightclubs, cabarets, social clubs. So Havana especially had a very active and important nightlife, theaters. So all these spaces and all these situations enhance the popularity of these Cuban genres. And also, here it's important to talk about the film and music industry at the time, because these two, through this media, Cuban music also began to become very famous and popular, internationally speaking, right? So, for example, Cuban music reached to the United States or Mexico thanks to the record labels like RCA Victor or some very musical films of the time. From those kind of products, we know the Cuban song, the Cuban orchestras, the mambo, the rumberas, for example. They became very popular in this kind of production. And we can mention some very important figures like Rita Montaner or Ernesto Lecuona. Ernesto Lecuona, by the way, he was the first Latino to be nominated for an Oscar because of
Oh
his
wow.
film composition. So yes, Cuban music was on top, right? We were able to influence a lot the rest of the production in the continent. And of course, not everything was popular in dancing music, because also in the first decades and the two first decades, the 20th over there, it was a boon for classical music in Cuba as well. And we have very important musicians. They were composing in the most avant-garde trends at the moment. For example, Alejandro Garcia Caturla or Amadeo Roldan. They really introduced contemporary trends that sought to break with the traditional way of making classical music in Cuba. So we called this style like Afro-Cubanism into the classical music. So it was a really prolific moment, let's say, right? So we start there to talk now about what
Well,
happened.
in general, I think that there's like this really, I mean, it's like all kinds of things going on between the 20s, 1920s, up until the revolution, 1959, where you had like soul music, soul montuno, mambo, and then in the 50s, and I mean, 40, you had the big band swing and stuff, which influenced mambo, but you had what was going on in the 50s in New York City was all these famous jazz artists like Miles Davis, and you had like Dizzy Gillespie, helping to, and Chano Pozo creating this, Afro-Cuban jazz. So it's like all this musical development. And I mean, this happened in the United States too. There was kind of this history, but in Cuba, it was like this awesome interchange that sort of like just rapid development over like, I don't know, 30 or 40 years. And then the revolution kind of came, and then it was like this sort of abrupt change, some for the good, some for the bad, right? And so, yeah, so continue.
Yes, yes. Well, then the revolution, this socialist and communist revolution got to power. They won, and then of course it was a big change in the island in many ways. For example, the first thing we can mention is the migration of a lot of Cuban artists to United States or Puerto Rico, because some of them didn't agree about the new policies of this revolutionary government, right? So this left the Cuban music industry without several of its most prominent artists. So Celia Cruz, for example, is one of the most clear example about that, right? So, and this new government, the Fidel Castro's government, they closed many of the venues I mentioned before, where this popular music was usually heard, such, for example, the nice clubs and the social clubs, because many of these places belong to the mafia established on the island, right? And their gambling, prostitution, and other activities were practiced. So these activities went against the ideals of the new socialist regime. So that's why this new system or government closed all those places. But also this affected the musicians in a negative way, because that was one of the main source of work and income, right? So I would like to make a parenthesis in some way here to mention that this specific situation I was telling right now was one of the causes of the decline of Cuban son, this beautiful music.
You kind of went to New York, right? We could do another episode about that, but there's how son kind of turned into salsa music, and there's some incorrect history about that. But so basically, it seemed like the goal was to kind of get rid of all this culture from the mafia. Like, it wasn't directly to attack music or musicians. It just kind of ended up that way because I guess the government, the new socialist government, Fidel Castro, the revolutionaries, they didn't like what the culture that the mafia had created in Cuba, which brought like prostitution and drugs and things like that. And it seemed like the musicians got the bad end of the stick, I guess you could say. Anyways, continue.
Exactly. This is a secondary effect for musicians. It wasn't a direct attack to music, no, at all. A lot of this music, this Cuban son or danzón or mambo had gone out of fashion because of that. They don't have any more these places, so they can play this music anymore. And that's why, for example, we have this phenomenon, the Buena Vista Social Club, that became like a romantic story, about elderly figures of Cuban music that were forgotten. Now they are once again exalted, right? But why were they forgotten? Because Cubans in general, they weren't listening anymore that Cuban son or that mambo or that danzón, right? So yes, we should have another meeting and another episode just to talk about Buena Vista Social Club and all this story. But well, that's one of the first effects, and continuing with the theme, right, of the changes that occurred in terms of musical practice in Cuba after this revolution. Let's talk about the young musicians, for example. They began to study classical music instead of popular music because of the opening of music school. So this is not itself like a bad thing.
So to clarify, there were no music schools before the revolution?
Oh, yes.
They're private music schools, or how do you know?
Exactly.
They're private. Okay.
Private
So this wasn't something that the population really had access to unless you were a little more privileged, had some money or something like that. It was like a, you had to pay.
Is with this Cuban Revolution, we can talk about like a massive access to arts and university careers or study in a massive way. So that's not happening in the past, just in this moment. But is these new musical institutions, they were focused mainly in classical music. So yes, they also studied popular music, but classical music was the most important, mainly because the Soviets influence. We had then a lot of pianists. The ballet or the classical music in Russia in general, they have a very strong and high standing school for this kind of music. So we were trying to reach that level, but we are not very similar to Russians in culturally speaking. Like we were playing son and rumba and cha cha cha, and now we want to be a big star for classical music and study Tchaikovsky and Stravinsky. It's like, yeah, we like it because we're very open-minded people and we love art, but yeah,
But now that you mention that, though, I mean the attention on classical music just further added to the fusion and the adaptability of Cuban musicians. Because I mean, I still believe this because I've studied in Cuba. I've been to many different places, but I still think Cuban musicians are some of the best in the world. And I think it has to do with the music schools because you'll go through programs with classical music at the same time, like in the neighborhoods, you hear Bembe playing, you hear like Afro-Cuban religion ceremonies happening with like very syncopated rhythms and stuff. And like that's like part of the life of Cubans. And then you go to, which you can talk a little bit about that, I guess, how that happened in the revolution too, with like religion and stuff. But the religion part of the music, it was already in the blood. And then you go learn classical music, and it's just, I think, just this giant fusion that just contributes to being awesome. Anyways, my little comment about that.
No, it's very accurate because it's what happened. Actually, we should like admit in some way that Cuba, we have a very special gift for music in some way. All the Caribbean region in general, we have a lot of musical genres and dance and many things. So then we create this amazing fusion with the European styles and music, and we have great piano players from that time. They learned from the Russian school, and they became very famous and very important in the international scene for classical music. So and they learned from the Russian school. That's a fact. We have also this big change in the approach to music and the academy, let's say. But also, we should say that the new government forced musicians to go through these institutions to be able to practice professionally as a musician. We should mention this because this okay, not 100% of the musicians had to be academy graduates, but for those who were not from this institution, from an academy, it was really difficult to become professional. But in the other side, we have all these schools, and we have a very special movement, is the New Trova. The Nueva Trova is the name for this movement, is very, very important. Why so important? Well, because it's a kind of music related to protest song with a very political content. But in Cuba, unlike other countries in Latin America, it is not against the government, but in favor. So this is what makes so interesting the Trova movement in Cuba. Used to be like protest music, but in Cuba was singing about the changes because it was a left-wing movement and it was a left-wing government. So they agree about that. And it's a sample, like it shows how some musicians really adapted to this new political context in some way, right? So from that movement, we have Silvio Rodríguez, Pablo Milanés, we have important musicians, Noel Nicola. They reflect these new leftist ideals promoted by the revolutionary government, right? If you are really interested in political topics, you will love to learn about Trova, the Nueva Trova in Cuba, because is that they are very, very connected with the political changes. And personally, it's one of my favorite kind of music. We would be uploading an interview that we did to one of these trovadores or troubadours, something like that in English now. And we will talk in more details about this specific music.
So to clarify something about Nueva Trova,
Yeah.
I mean, because there may be some misinformation about this out there, and I want to know your perspective on this as a musicologist and what you studied. Some people might think that the Nueva Trova movement and the lyrics and the music was sort of forced to be, pro-government, but you say these people were pro-government. They supported the revolution. They wrote lyrics because they felt passionate about the movement, right? The revolutionary changes.
Exactly. It's like that. Look, a lot of these composers of new trova, they came from a project that was called Grupo de Experimentación Sonora del ICAIC. It's hard to translate, but it was like a project.
We'll put it in the comments.
Okay. Look, when revolution got to power, the first ministry they found was the art or culture ministry. So for this new system, for this new government, art and culture was really, really important. They prioritized culture. Means this Fidel Castro and all of them, they were intellectuals and they really love art and culture, and they want to provide that for everyone in Cuba. They founded the culture ministry, and then they create this project, the Grupo de Experimentación Sonora del ICAI. It was like a kind of a school for people who want to learn classical music, academical music, and they were able now to compose, to write music, like more elaborate music for the new cinema. In the new industry, the new Cuban cinema industry into the revolution. So from that project, we have all these musicians. So that means they have this, they're living, they're experiencing in themselves the revolution. They came from nothing almost, and now they are starting with one of the most important composers at the time. Leo Brouwer was one of the most important classical musicians at the time, and is still one of the most important. Just for provide a clear sample, Leo Brouwer is a big guitar composer and maestro for that. If you are in a certainment of guitar, you will hear one of his masterpieces because they are mandatory. So it's a big institution itself, like a big authority. And this guy, he was a teacher for Silvio Rodríguez, for Pablo Milanés. He was sharing with these people for free all his knowledge about classical music and composition. So these young people were learning all that for free. They were living that big changes in their lives. Of course, they are singing about that. They are telling all that, but now with a very high elaborate language, with beautiful lyrics, with a lot of poetry in there, and a very complex language, not just in musical terms, also in lyrical, about the lyrics and all that stuff. So that's why trova is so interesting and it's so beautiful. And that means also a lot of Cubans who were studying at the university at the time, they were able to understand this kind of music. So they were living like a very dramatic moment, like in a good way, like a terrific moment, because it's like, okay, I came from the countryside from almost nothing, and I'm just enjoying, and I can read this very complex literature, and I can feel, I can connect with this. So all that what's happening at the moment, no? And I'm speaking even from my own experience, because I didn't born at the moment, but my mom, she's from that specific time, and she's telling me all this stuff to me.
This is interesting because I don't think a lot of people hear this perspective, especially in the United States, because, of course, it's just been a bunch of negative propaganda for many, many years. But like, if you think objectively, for what Cuban working class, lower class, poor class, whatever you want to say, the way that they felt for over 400 years since like colonialism, and arguably, I know this is debatable, like the neo-colonial era of the United States controlling Cuba, and not really having like their own. And I think that's also why it was probably nationalistic, and also ties in with the music. But like, I think a lot of people felt in that moment that that was the first time Cuban people felt like this is our country. A lot of people say the independence happened after the Spanish War, but that was just kind of what I think Cubans were told. Like, oh, we have independence from Spain, but now here's the United States, and you have control from the United States. And there were some positive things about the musical collaboration for the United States. I love that there was this connection with New Orleans and all these things. But then there was this other just kind of, and that's what you're describing, and not many of us know about that. Your mom was there. My wife's grandmother was there. My mother-in-law was there, and they all tell me these stories that we don't get to hear about. How did people actually feel? And through Nueva Trova, I feel like that was a way that people got to express that. People got to enjoy that. And mind you, these people who got to study at the university under these great musicians would have probably never been able to, because they wouldn't have been able to afford that, because it was private institutions before. Now that was I guess education became a human right. We saw that in the literacy rates too, right? In Cuba, where literacy rates were, I don't know, 50, 60%, and then eventually went up to, well into over 90%. And so like the same time, you see like education in general in Cuba, doctors, things like that. But like not many people hear about the music part. And, fortunately, you got to study at Cuban schools. I've been able to see them. But just to know that, I mean, I'm someone who went to music school and I still have student debt for it. But you're talking about the level of like Juilliard and these great music schools and stuff that Cuba was like, okay, here, let's give this high level of education for classical music and academic music, and just share it with anybody who is interested and wants to be a part of this. I think that was just absolutely amazing. I think one of my favorite parts about what happened in the Cuban Revolution.
We are talking about a free and accessible music education system of very high standards for all citizens in some way. So they create a lot of national music schools and conservatories, and these institutions offered high quality musical training completely free, as I said before. Some of these schools is, for example, the National School of Music, the Amadeo Roldan Conservatory, but the way we used to visit them in some of our tours.
We do. It's one of the, especially the jazz festival.
I really want to see all this we're talking about. Well,
it's still there. It's still a great thing. I mean, there's musicians, Cuban musicians all over the world that I think at the end of the day, they're going to admit, like, if it wasn't for my education in Cuba, they wouldn't be at the level they're at. And I just know some musicians that I would dream to be as good as they are, and I've lived in Cuba. I lived in Cuba for almost a year, and I studied, and it's just not in my blood. It's not, it's this combination of like, oh, you have a 2-year-old, you're teaching them to dance salsa and clap the clave, and then they go to music school at, I think, around 7 years old, right? I think my wife said she went, and you studied with her, Yami. She started at 7 years old in music school, and you can go all the way like you did to university, Superior Art Institute, and then you went to do your master's too. So you had a long education for music, and it's just been your whole life. And I don't know, I mean, we do this now, we show this to people. We're tour leaders, and we have this, musical getaways and Havana music tours, but just to think of like our whole lives have been music. But if I would have been 7 years old and been able to go to a music school, like there was no opportunity for that. There was no music school in the United States for elementary school, middle school. Maybe if you go to middle school, or maybe at the end of elementary school, they have like a music appreciation class where you listen to classical music. Maybe you can be, when you get to middle school, high school, you could be in marching band or you can be in the jazz band. But this is like a small portion of I mean, maybe even less than 10% of what you're learning in the total curriculum. And there are no specialty music schools, not that I know of. There probably are private ones, but especially in the public school system, and growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, this doesn't exist. But the schools that you and my wife were able to go to are just exclusively music schools. I mean, you would study other things, right? You would study math and science and things like that, but the majority of things were music, right?
Yes, that's right. It's a very complete program that provides a very solid technical and theoretical foundation. So you can see that diversity in the Cuban musicians. You can see how versatile they are, and they have a lot of tools, right, to play music. Cuba is a very musical place. It is one of the most important legacy we have from this Cuban Revolution. And you may think, how is possible being so poor, like lacking so many other things, how you can be so good performance, how you can spend so much time practicing or studying music if you need to cover other stuff? Well, because actually Cuban government create a full system to support artists. So that means, for example, once you finish your study and you got your degree to be a musician, to be an actor, or to be a dancer, you will receive a salary every month just to be an artist. We know art is not like basic needs, like it's not food in that way, it's not water. Like that's why Cuban government is supporting artists in this way. Like, we want you to do this, we want you to be thinking about your music, your art, to express that. So we will provide your salary. Of course, they need to like replace that salary with at least 2 or 3 or 4 activities in a school or something like that. But it's a kind of system where they ensure this basic way of living for all artists in general. So that's why you travel to Cuba and you can see so much art and so many artists, good artists, everywhere. Even is that when we are looking many other things.
I guess we could talk about that a lot. Like one thing I think just to mention real quick was, and this is things I've been told by older folks in Cuba who have lived through the era when Cuba and the Soviet Union were very connected before the special period, was that the rations for food in La Bodega were and Cuba went through its hard time with the Soviet Union collapsing and many different changes, bringing on private sector of tourism and so many things in the 90s and up until today. But I was told that in the 70s and 80s, it's maybe more so in the 80s, that there was sort of this really good support system for food and things like that, that a lot of folks didn't feel like they needed to go. There wasn't like what we're seeing, in the recent history of like, food shortages and stuff like that, was that there was this sort of sense of being provided for, so like you could go to La Bodega and you could get, your rations for your family, and you had enough rice, you have enough meat, maybe it wasn't preferential, maybe it wasn't like going to a nice fancy restaurant or having that sort of selection, but, artists and musicians could, sort of relax in their studies and, not be so stressed about, because in the United States, it's like you go to study, and if you're not super privileged with a rich family, you have to go pay for your apartment, you have to pay rent, you have to do all this stuff. And I'm not saying that everything was easy for everybody, but it seemed like you went to study at music school, and there your family was behind you too. They're like, oh, they're so proud of you, because going to a music school or something is like a prestigious thing in Cuba, right? It's almost like more important than a doctor or something. It seems like, it's like musicians and doctors are like this, like, oh, you're so important to us, and but I think there's little economic factors that helped with that development as well, because when you see Cuban musicians that get to practice like all day in the United States, it's like you may go to music school and then you would like have to go work a part-time job, like maybe you're a bartender, or you're like, for me, I worked at Hertz rental car, and I had to go drive cars around after they got cleaned. And I did all these little stupid odd jobs that did nothing but waste my time, because it wasn't that much money, and it was just enough money to live, to get basic necessities, which is one of the beautiful things I thought about when La Bodega was functioning really well. Maybe it's not functioning as well today, but I think in the 70s and 80s, I wasn't there, but maybe your mom and, I've heard from Yami's grandmother, my mother-in-law, that things were a little better in that regard. And I think there's some contribution to that as far as being able to study and not stress, just focus 100% on the education, becoming better, being able to practice. Another beautiful thing I think that happened in that.
You heard about the Maslow triangle, or look, we should be honest as well and talk about the censorship at that moment and at the beginning in the 60s and 70s, because that also was a reality. Like, for example, rock and roll music or funk music was seen as an imperialist or decadent influence from the United States. So radio, television, broadcasting of rock music was prohibited because they consider that like a bad influence for Cuban people, or for the new ideological moment, no? So some Cuban artists, for example, who have ventured into rock music, such as Synthesis, for example, or even Manguare. Manguare is a very famous orchestra from Cuba. They were censored and had to change and abandon that musical style, or fusion or mix that rock style with other Afro-Cubans or more Cuban genres, because they like it, but also because they want to avoid being completely censored at the time. But when you are a good artist, of course, and you are a very creative person, then you take some bad situation or restrictive situation and you change that, and you take that and you put in a more in a new place, let's say, an avant-garde theme. So you can hear that in the Synthesis music. Synthesis is a band. You can hear rock influences and funky music or irakere, and then that rock Afro-Cuban music, so rumba, or from the folkloric music, all of that fusioned in that beautiful music, right? So same happened to disco music. That changed with the time. With time, no, we had a minister of culture. He was a big fan of rock music, so this person was a key in this change, because he was able to speak in first person and say, okay, rock music is not bad itself. Look, we are more close to rock character than many other music.
I think I mean, even we see this a lot in Cuba, right? Things are prohibited, like after the revolution, like religion, things like that. I've even heard like yoga was prohibited, but you would still find that like people would listen to this music. I mean, they were getting it, like people were bringing records from Russia. It'd be like, you can still today find, we have some friends that have records like the Beatles and stuff like that are like maybe it's not the Beatles exactly, but there are some records that are like some American rock music and funk music and stuff that are like pressed in like Russian. And they brought those, so, like, and people brought stuff on, eventually on their laptops and stuff like that, computers, and the music got there. And then also is the story, DJ Higwe, our good friend, Isnai and Ined at Guampara Productions, the first Afro-Cuban record label. They do a wonderful experience that we do with them that kind of goes through this history at a listening experience. We do a listening experience where we listen to these records and we find out what was happening at the time. And some of these antennas, I forgot the name of the town, but these antennas were able to pick up like radio stations and stuff in Miami, right? And people were listening and they were hearing it. So like it was already there. Maybe that's why the cultural minister eventually was like, I like rock music. How do you know about rock music? You were listening to it in your house, weren't you? Just like you were probably making clandestine wine and not, like maybe you have, you did like over 70% of people in Cuba are believed to have some connection to like, Afro-Cuban religion, like Santeria. You know, it was believed that some of the revolutionaries were santeros, you know, but technically religion became prohibited, you know, and some of these things just weren't fully enforced, you know. Maybe if it became some political or bureaucratic moment, or you became someone important in the government, it seems like maybe they would have a bigger eye on you. But people were listening to rock music, even though it was prohibited, you know, hence synthesis. I mean, they were listening to it. That's how they got that influence to make that music, you know.
Of course, Cubans, we've been only very spiritual people, and were always practicing a kind of religion or spiritual activity or music culture. So it sometimes this mindset related to the communism in some way could be very, or at some point it was very blind to that kind of practices. Like they were trying to be very practical in some moment, so that's why some mistakes about it. But you can't thought that wings from people, or that will to connect with something abstract and bigger than you, whatever is that. So that's why all that changed. We are talking about censorship, but that was the 60, the 70. That's not the currently Cuba. You will hear all kind of music and style, and then we are able to enjoy these beautiful fusions with or traditional folk music with rock music and the crazy style you can imagine. So, and I think that's beautiful.
Hence the Yellow Submarine Bar, right? And the John Lennon Park. And you know, there's these tributes to the Beatles, and you know, the Beatles were important to Cuba. You know, maybe at one point you couldn't listen to them, but now you go and you can, right next to John Lennon Park, you can go to the Yellow Submarine Bar, and you know, maybe they don't have a live band playing all the time, but you can go in and hear rock music. And things have totally changed, completely changed.
No,
I don't know.
you can
I feel like Cuba, yeah.
no rock live music. In the Yellow Submarine, they have these cover bands playing all rock
Beatles.
music, Beatles or AC/DC or whatever you want. And just remember, we listened to the Rolling Stones in a live concert in Havana for
2016, right?
free. Exactly.
You were
So
there. Were you there?
uh, no,
You weren't there?
I,
Oh, yeah.
because
Yanni said she was there. I heard that they let a lot of the musicologists get, you know, like kind of like a VIP section. But the Rolling Stones went to Cuba and they played for free, right? And it was a huge event. I wasn't there, but they apparently donated all their gear afterwards. That's what I heard. So they went. They like you know, Cubans love the Rolling Stones, and they just finally went. They played for free. You know, of course, Cubans aren't gonna. You know, nobody has like the infrastructure to pay the kind of money the Rolling Stones would charge. You know, here in the United States, you go pay hundreds of dollars to go see these famous artists. But that's so beautiful that they went to Cuba and they played for free, and then they donated their equipment. So big applause to the Rolling Stones for doing that. That was cool.
and you mentioned it right now, like the musicologists, they got like a VIP section. Well, musicology, for example, that's another contribution from this revolutionary government. All that kind of studies, the related to Cuban music and Cuban folklore, for example, and allowing Cuban researchers and academics to study and to analyze our music or popular music or ancestral music, and then to preserve the opening of this kind of studies has been crucial for the preservation and promotion of our musical heritage in general. And that was possible because this mindset from the this ideological approach to our folklore, to our traditions, like let's open a full career just to study the rumba and to study or drums or punto guajiro, all this amount of music and genres we have in Cuba. Before 59, we had Fernando Ortiz, for example. He was an intellectual, very important. But just right after 59 and that new system, then everyone interested in that kind of a study with that curious mind about culture, about music, were able to study that in a very professional way. We have the SIDM, is the Yami. She was part of that institution, the SIDM.
Yeah, they're still good friends of ours, and we rely on them a lot to make sure we're giving out correct information as far as like history and stuff. Because of course, this conversation right here, like this is not, we have famous books from Ned Sublett, the New York University musicologist that I look up to a lot, that wrote Cuba and its music. It's like, but it's up until the revolution, and there was maybe a lot more information about that because it was, there was a lot more tourism and international connection, and then there's sort of this moment where like, we don't know what's going on in Cuba. So like SIDMUC is a beautiful thing because they've been studying it, they've been writing it down. They actually have a blog. I don't even know, it's like a WordPress blog, but they constantly are publishing stuff that is very interesting, like the history of salsa music, which we're going to make an episode about. Very interesting. Everybody's like, where's salsa from? New York. It's like, no, look at the revolution. Like, look what happened. Like literally, like there was like Son Montuno is basically what we're calling salsa. All the rhythms. I mean, there's some different orchestrations going on, but like the cascara, the clave, what's going on with the timbales, what's going on, and all the different instrumentations and the horns and stuff like that. It sort of evolved a little bit, but the core characteristics of it are what was going on in Cuba before the revolution. And almost immediately after the revolution, you see things like Fania Records coming up with salsa music, and then there's no dedication to Cuba. Why don't we talk that this music came from Cuba? We see, I mean, Yami showed me these videos of different groups in like the 20s and 30s playing Son Montuno that was like, sounds just like salsa. It is salsa. Salsa, actually, my drum teacher told me salsa is not a real style of music. It's a dip that you put your chips in. But we're gonna have a whole episode about that because I want to talk about that. We're going to Cali in about a month, Cali, Colombia, and they consider themselves the capital of salsa. But there's also an interesting history there that's connected with Cuban musicians. So, there's this awesome contribution to the world for Cuban music, and I think a lot of people don't know about it. But those who do, they love Cuba. They wanna learn more about Cuba and what happened. Of course, there's like a lot more information about this that we can go into detail. I think what we're going to do is we're going to take little topics, what we've been talking about, maybe schools and stuff like that. We're going to have different episodes on that. But in general, I think it's safe to say that, there were like positives and negatives in the Cuban Revolution. Any revolution, there's always something. There's always good things that happen and bad things. The French Revolution, we can go back and we can say there were some net positives coming out of feudalism into modern day capitalism, but it wasn't perfect. None of it was perfect. And I'm sure there's people in the government in Cuba that would admit that there were mistakes made along the way. But to this day, I think one of the most beautiful things that we can, and to your education, to my wife's education, to the little bit of education that I've been able to gather by going to Cuba so much and doing our tours, is that this focus on music education and art institutions has survived all the changes. And to this day, it's still a human right in Cuba to be able to go to music school and be able to get an education, whether you want to be a doctor, an attorney, or whether you want to be a musician. You have that right in Cuba. You can find your way to where you want to go. And I don't know if this is still the case, but one of the things that I've been told historically is that Cuba did try to provide an elemental music school in every province. Whether you lived in Guantanamo or Las Tunas or somewhere where it was far off and not that close to Havana or the trade or what was going on in the rest of the country, that the Cuban government did try to provide an education across the entire island in the same way they did for medical systems. There's some place in the mountains, in the Sierra Maestra Mountains, where people didn't have a dentist, but a dentist started coming by once a week, or they didn't have a clinic they could go to have medical services or be checked out by a doctor. In the same way, there was this priority of like, how do we get education across the whole island? And it's a big island. It's the biggest island in the Caribbean. So at the end of the day, Cuba's changed a lot, went through a lot of transformations. And and now I think that Cuba has found a sort of, even though they're struggling in different ways, they've sort of found a nice hybrid system to move forward, and they're not letting that interrupt the music education and the art education. We still see that as a big priority. One of our tour leaders, Ismailis, is still an elementary music school teacher. And we've been fortunate to have videos of like what she's working on and stuff and what these kids are doing. And we've been to the school, we tour the schools. And it's just such a beautiful thing to see, kids being able to learn at such a young age. And I think that kind of summarizes what this episode's about. And I think we can go into some further detail on different things. But any last thoughts on this podcast and this episode, Rocío?
No, I agree with you. Like, hopefully, we just provide an overview. It was a brief introduction in some way to a very interesting topic. So we've been writing about this in our blogs, and we hopefully continues talking about this and developing all these ideas. So follow us.
And also, if anyone's interested in continuing this education, whether you go on a tour with us or not, look up our friend DJ Higué. We'll try to put a link or something to our experience if you want to just do the a la carte experience. But DJ Higué goes through a beautiful, like a very well thought out presentation where you can listen to vinyl records of each moment in history. Even things that we didn't get into today about how hip hop music came into Cuba in the, I guess, late 80s, early 90s, and how that helped develop certain things in Cuba. There's a lot of history with this. We're going to post some information in the description on YouTube, and maybe we'll do a little blog about this too. But yeah, this has been a great episode, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in another episode.
See you next time.
Thanks, Rocío.